Man, I'm so energized to be here. This is such a fantastic event, you know. We've talked about this a bit already today, just in among people in the audience, but I just have been thinking that when I started doing the kind of work that I'll describe to you today, I couldn't have imagined a gathering like this and the kinds of discussions that I've heard already today. So this is fantastic. I'm as was mentioned, a cognitive neuroscientist. I have been at the University of Waterloo for quite some time. I'm going to talk about boring buildings, and I'm going to give you what, to me, basically is an update on work that I started quite a long time ago. So the story for me actually begins in 2011, 14 years ago. I was out of the blue approached by a traveling urbanism think tank called the BMW Guggenheim Lab, organized by the Guggenheim Museum in New York, funded by BMW, and their plan was to go take a roving lab to different world cities and to talk about urbanism. And they said, you know, we need a researcher, we need somebody who can do experiments, to design an experiment to follow suit. And I said, sure, I could do that, thinking there's no way that I could do that in the time frame that they'd given me. So what I did for that lab with my collaborator, Charles Montgomery, author of The Happy City, a fantastic book, was to design a study along the lines of which we had never seen done before, which was to try to do some experimental psychology on the street itself. So we designed a walk, and we took people from place to place. We asked them questions, we measured their bodies. I'll be talking a bit about skin conductance today. I meant to bring a gizmo to show you how we measure skin conductance. The baby was crying as I was packing to leave, so it didn't happen. But I'll give you a bit more details as we go. So we designed this walk, as I said. We decided we wanted to highlight contrasts in a city. This was done in New York, it was done in Berlin and in Mumbai. The images that you're seeing here are what we call high complexity streetscapes, the one on the left in New York and the one on the right in Mumbai. We wanted to contrast what happened to people when they were standing in front of these high complexity streetscapes with what happened to them when they stood in places like this. On the left, you can see a beleaguered Whole Foods store in Lower Manhattan, which was prime as a candidate for a low complexity design. And on the right, you can see that's actually a restaurant in Berlin, about as low complexity as you can possibly get. And we were just astonished that we were able to find this. So we did other things as well. We basically were at this stage mucking about, not really knowing what to do, not really knowing how we wanted to define complexity, but knowing when we looked at these places that we had it. And we asked questions, and as I said, we measured people's bodies. And the graph that you're looking at here, I have quite a few graphs to show you, sorry, is a graph of arousal level, as it says, relative to baseline. So all we did was to measure people's, think of it basically as a sweat gland response, as a proxy for physiological arousal. We measured that value when people were at baseline, which was in the lab before we left. We measured it when they were standing in front of a low complexity building like a Whole Foods and a high complexity building like the ones that we showed you, and that I showed you. And you can see there's a measurable difference. Arousal went up during the high complexity exposures and down during low complexity. The other thing that we discovered was that if you ask people questions about their experiences when they're standing in these places, they are, perhaps not surprisingly to this group, report that they don't feel very happy when they're standing in front of low complexity buildings. They told us other things as well, but basically they signaled low emotion or low affect. Now I have a colleague who studies boredom. He makes people bored deliberately in his lab, and he's very good at it. And he tells me that this combination of low arousal and low affect or emotion is the absolute signature for boredom. When you see these things together, you know that people are bored. So this heartened me to think that maybe I was onto something here. The study that I did in 2011 was basically a small-scale demo study. I wrote about it. I wrote a book about it in 2015. I was really surprised that the biggest response I got to both the book and to the excerpts, this is an excerpted chapter from Eon, had to do with my findings about boredom and buildings. And it led me to think that I was really onto something here. And I made the argument, and I would still make this argument, and I think you'll hear more evidence along the lines of this argument today, that experiencing boredom in streetscapes is actually a matter of public health. It's not at all unreasonable to suppose that when we're chronically exposed to these kinds of settings, we are more likely to experience shorter lifespans, increased incidence of metabolic disorders, and depression and addiction. So it's a hard argument to make that if I stand you in front of a Whole Foods store for 5 minutes, you're going to take heroin. But over the course of exposure, days, months, weeks, and years to these kinds of settings, it's more likely that there are these kinds of effects to be seen. So fast forward to this year, I was delighted and a little bit terrified when Thomas Heatherwick's studio asked me if I could repeat the study, extend the study, but now do it for real, do it with rigorous methods that would stand up to scrutiny and peer review. And I said yes, and in the back of my mind there was a small voice saying, what happens if it doesn't work this time? What happens if my demo study doesn't pan out? As you'll see, that's not what happened. So here's the route that we took for the study. Just as in the old work, we had people walk from place to place. When they stood in front of buildings, and I'll show you the buildings in just a second, we asked them questions and we measured their bodies using skin conductance and some other measures as well. Here are the buildings. There were 6 of them. They're all around here, obviously. If you scan through these images, you probably don't have much difficulty deciding which are the more complex images and which are the less complex images. Of course, the more complex images are in the top row. We wanted to do what we hadn't done in the earlier work with BMW Guggenheim, and that was we wanted to try to find a way to quantify complexity. And there are lots of different ways that you could do that. The way that we settled on was an old standard measure of something called fractal dimension. And I won't bore you with the details of the method that we used, other than to say that we used a classic method called box counting. You can see it illustrated here. Basically, you take the image of the building, you place a lattice over the top of it, and you count the number of boxes in the lattice that intersect contours in the design. And if you do that at a range of different scales, you end up with a lovely graph. And the slope of the line in that graph is a measure of complexity, at least according to fractal dimension. Just all of this is just to convince you, hopefully, that we actually used a real method to measure complexity. When you apply that method to the buildings that I showed you, you can see the differences here in measured fractal dimension of the upper buildings and the lower buildings. It doesn't look that big. The number doesn't look all that different, but the effect of the difference in that number is quite dramatic in terms of what you see on the street. So we had 71 people walking through these sites in the city. We asked them lots of questions. Here's one kind of question we asked them. We used something called self-assessment mannequins. They're a bit small. You might not easily be able to make out what's being shown here, but it's a really nice and robust way of assessing people's psychological state. Everybody understands what you're asking. The top row has to do with people's emotional state, their mood. The middle has to do with people's levels of arousal, and the bottom has to do with a measure called dominance. And this is a classic triad that's used in environmental psychology all the time. And if you look at the bars, you can see that happily for us, the values for emotion, for arousal, and for dominance were all higher in the high complexity, in front of the high complexity buildings. Here's some other measures and findings. We asked people explicitly to tell us which buildings they thought were more complex, and that's what you can see in the middle. Happily, people's appraisals of the buildings line up with our carefully quantified measures of fractal dimension. We also asked people how interesting the buildings were. Those are the bars that you see on the right. And how beautiful they thought the buildings were, and those are the bars on the left. And again, you can see that on every score, people appraise the high complexity buildings as being more beautiful, more interesting, more arousing, more pleasant than the low complexity buildings. We also looked at some measures of what is called attention restoration. So there's a major theory in my field that talks about the kinds of things that restore our ability to pay attention. The idea being that over the average everyday experience in an urban environment, your ability to pay attention is degraded over time. It becomes more and more difficult for you to focus. And so attention restoration, which is normally described in the context of things like exposure to green space, attention restoration has to do with what it takes to restore that attention. And there's a scale called perceived restorativeness. We measured the high and low complexity buildings on that scale and again found that the high complexity buildings were more likely to be perceived as being restorative in the sense of attention restoration. So far, all well and good. You might think, well, psychological measures, it's kind of hard to think of people responding in any other way to the kinds of questions that we asked about the kinds of buildings that I showed you. What about the physiology? What happens when you measure skin conductance? So here's what we found. You can see the thumbnail sketches of two of the buildings. There's a high complexity building on the left, a low complexity building on the right. And the traces, the graphs that you see above those these are each from one individual person. So these represent what happens to someone's arousal level as they stand in front of one of these buildings for a period of 5 minutes. And you can see that when standing in front of the high complexity building, arousal levels tend to drift upwards over that time. And when they stand in front of the low complexity building, arousal levels tend to drift downwards. And that's actually a much better measure of what's happening when people are in these locations than comparing to baseline, because you're comparing what happens over the minutes of exposure. Now, as I mentioned, these are representative samples from the study. So all scientists know that when you show representative samples, you're showing some of the best samples of what it is that you want to argue. So the real money question is what happens when you look at everything all together? And here's what you see. We lost a few people because with physiology that tends to happen, but the change in skin conductance levels on average were significantly higher when people were standing in front of the high complexity than in front of the low complexity buildings. So the short version of the story is that very small demo style study that we did in 2011 bore out completely in this the study that we did this year in London. I should mention that we've also done the study in Toronto with a somewhat smaller sample. I don't have data to show yet, but there's every reason to think that it'll mirror what I'm showing you here. In terms of what all of this means, when I think about complexity and why complexity matters in streetscapes, I think of it in at least a couple of different ways. You can make a biological argument following the work of a scientist named Daniel Berline that we are drawn to complexity because complexity signals where there's information. We're infovores. Every animal that I've ever looked at is similar in the sense that it gravitates to information. A cockroach will prefer locations where there's more information than less information. For a human being, where we basically live by our wit because we don't, for the most part, have fangs and claws, information becomes incredibly important because it's the sustenance for our wit. So what Berline said is that there's a sweet spot for a preference for complexity in environments. And you might all recognize this from your own experience. You can go too far with complexity, and it no longer is pleasant or attractive. But if you hit that sweet spot, then that will be the optimal condition for your mind, your body, your nervous system. I think there's a metaphorical argument to be made too. This is a planner whose work I'm very fond of, Jane Jacobs, who talked, if you read I'll read you the long quote. Genuine rich diversity of the built environment is always the product of many, many different minds, and at its richest, also the product of different periods of time with their different aims and fashions. So I think what Jacobs was saying is that when you see complexity in the urban terrain, you're reading from that complexity something about the story of the process by which that landscape came to be. And when you see that kind of complexity, that rich variety of different elements, then what it's telling you is that there was a grassroots democratic process by which that development took place, that there were many hands that were at play in building whatever has been built. So I think that's the other reason why complexity matters. I think that the metaphorical argument and the biological argument are probably linked, but in 10 minutes, I can't really get into that. So I'll just stop here. Oh, thank you. Oh my goodness, oh poor Jathish. I wanted to show, Jathish Srikantharajah is the person who did all the hard work. He came over and did the measuring. I just get to come and talk about things. He did a brilliant job of the study along with a couple of students from Loughborough. Brandon is here. Brandon was on the ground doing the hard work as well. Couldn't have happened without these fellas.
Thank you so much, Colin. Can you just outline what's happening next in terms of publishing and peer reviewing and all of that?
Sure, yeah. We are, and by we I mean Jathish. He's at home now working on the data. We are processing the data from Toronto. We plan to prepare a manuscript for publication. We haven't decided where to send it yet. We're thinking there's a good journal called Cities and Health that I think would be an ideal venue for this article. So that's the next step.
Good. I'm going to come to the audience, but I'm going to start off with Thomas because I can see lots of hands raising. Just pop it on.
Colin, just very quickly, I just wanted to ask you, there are three architectural writers in Britain who have salaried on national publications, and one of them said, when reviewing Humanise, said, oh, well, this is based on fake science. I wondered how you respond to the argument that is this fake science?
I don't know what more I could possibly say other than the findings that I just put up for you. It's definitely the real thing. I mean, mine is by far not the only kind of research that suggests these kinds of links between the design of the built environment and human health, psychological health, what I like to call psychological sustainability. I think there's a growing tide of understanding for these linkages. So I know that I'm slightly biased perhaps, but it beggars my imagination to think of how people could deny even at a first person level, we all know, we can feel what happens to us when we're in these, as you describe them, soulless, boring horizons. When we go looking for good sites to do our research, we don't have to use meters and measuring instruments. We can just do what I think great architects do, which is feel with their body what's happening. We know it's true. Well, all I'm doing is applying numbers and data to the things that I think in our hearts we know are true to give more oomph to the movement.
Okay, we've got, try and get around everyone, that lady in there.
Hi, thanks, Colin. I think we know each other from the Centre for Conscious Design. Anna Kim, I work at the intersection of human thriving in the built environment. And while in principle I find these arguments very compelling, I mean, I wrote something over 10 years ago about the value of aesthetics to human thriving and human capabilities. Looking at buildings, though, in isolation, I'm just wondering, the sensorium of a city or an environment is much more than our encounter with the facades of buildings. As you know, there's lighting, there's so many things phenomenologically that we experience. And one could also argue that in a lot of urban contexts, we're in a position of overload, of sensory overload, right? I mean, having just been in Berlin last weekend, I actually found quite soothing just the blank materiality of some facades, put it that way. So can we really this goes back to that question that Thomas asked about, how robust is this science if we're thinking about the whole ecology of a city or an environment, the whole sensorium, advertising, everything. We don't always want to be stimulated.
I don't think that I find much that I would disagree with in what you just said. I think one perspective I would take is first of all to recognize that you have to kind of do this in steps, that what we're doing is an evolutionary step beyond what was done in previous generations, decades, where people were mostly being presented with photographs, or not even photographs, just having descriptions of settings and asking to respond to them. So we're putting people into real settings. I'll admit that standing in front of a building for 5 minutes is not really a natural process, especially for a city like London. We don't stand still. And I think you're pointing to what, if I had another lifetime, I would want to do next, which is to appreciate the fact that human beings we're constantly in movement. We're encountering urban environments one after another. We're not seeing scenes like a succession of still lives. We're seeing something that's more dynamically unfolding. And I think we don't know anything about how that works. With the exception of 1 or 2 studies that I've seen, nobody has gone there. And part of the reason is because it's hard, but I don't think it means that it's intractable. And I think that is on point with respect to, or you're on point with respect to your argument that we may not necessarily want high complexity settings one after another. I think that there are rhythms that are important to us in cities that probably dictate the routes that we take when, for example, we walk from one place to another. We're setting our levels for the degree of complexity that we want. But again, I think that in the kind of science that I do, nobody has gone there yet to look at those things. But there are important questions for sure.
Is that on? Yeah. Colin, fascinating. So important to get the robustness of the evidence increasingly strong. And I'm interested over 10 years what level of research is going to layer with different authorities or your successors or your next 10 years to make this increasingly robust. That's really, really important. I've just got a couple of things to mention. You had a graph up there, if you could go back to it, showing a high complexity building goes from a high arousal to a low arousal, and vice versa. But if you look at the scale on the left, you still end up with more arousal than you do on at the left-hand side at the top. If you look at your measurement on the scale, am I reading that wrong? So even the lowest arousal on the low complexity building is higher arousal than the high complexity building. Is that right?
Yeah, you're not reading it wrong. This is the reason why we use as a measure change in skin conductance, because everybody's different. We might all arrive at a building in one particular physiological state, so what mattered to us is how that changed over that 5-minute exposure.
Okay, thank you. Just very quickly, sorry. The second one was, it's a dynamic journey of 45 minutes, not a static view of one building. And sometimes I've found that going from giving some fear and darkness and lack of a route out to then some calm and some hope and some happiness and discovery in an Italian village or wherever creates the best dynamic sensation, rather than a set of singular buildings, which goes to my point of doing a feedback loop on a multi-phase scheme, and perhaps picking one for the next 10 years to do that discovery with evidence in the real world.
Great.
Thank you.
One more question. Yes, I'll point to you.
Thank you, Colin. I wonder, is your research at all, or the sort of basis for your research interests, does it look at, sorry, let me rephrase, the work that Christopher Alexander did, that he wrote up in his magnum opus, The Nature of Order, blew my mind when I kind of waded through it a few years ago. I wonder whether, and that's obviously, I guess, all anecdotal and based on his experience, but not necessarily in any way researched. Is that an area that you're interested in? Are you familiar with that stuff?
Yeah, very much so. I wouldn't describe myself as an acolyte of Christopher Alexander's work, but definitely was a strong influence. And what you just said was one of the reasons that I wanted to do this work, because his arguments, though incredibly powerful, were not empirical. And so I wanted to see what happens if you put some of those ideas to the test in the laboratory or in the field. But yeah, huge influence.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we're going to have to call it a day with the questions, but Colin is hanging around afterwards, so please do speak to him. But can we all just give a round of applause for that brilliant presentation? Thank you.